Greetings from love, lies, and deception. The evening was dreary, and there was an uneasy tension in the air as Jonathan stood by his bedroom window, watching the rain pelt on the glass, as we explored the secrets and stories of infidelity. He couldn't get rid of the sense that something wasn't right. And then his thoughts were cut off when his father, Richard Jonathan, called. "I need to talk to you." "It's urgent," Richard began. "What's happening, Dad?" The drive to his father's office took no more than 15 minutes, but it felt endless with the plethora of thoughts racing through Jonathan's head. When Jonathan arrived at his father's office, he found Richard sitting at his desk with a grave expression on his face. The office walls were decorated with family photos, trophies, and awards, creating a cozy and safe atmosphere. But now this atmosphere felt deceptive, son. "I found something strange in our accounting books. It looks like someone in the company is trying to embezzle money. I wanted you to be the first to know," Richard said, looking intently at his son. "But why did you call me here at such a late hour?" "This is awful. I think it's one of our most trusted people," Jonathan said, trying to process what he had just heard. "I need your help to figure this out," Richard said in an anxious voice. Suddenly, the office door creaked open, and Jonathan's wife, Lisa, entered. She looked scared and worried. "John, I overheard your conversation and decided to come here." "What's going on?" Jonathan asked. "What are you doing here?" Lisa inquired, nervously looking about. "You should have been. She's asleep," Jonathan said. Surprised by her appearance, "I couldn't sleep. I felt something was wrong," Lisa said, sitting on the edge of the desk. "Lisa, you can stay. Maybe you can help us," Richard said, nodding toward a chair. The three of them began discussing the situation, trying to figure out who could be responsible throughout the conversation. Jonathan couldn't help but notice the strange looks exchanged between Lisa and Richard. These looks were filled with an inexplicable tension that he couldn't understand. "We need to be careful. If it's really someone we trust, we have to act quietly to avoid causing panic," Jonathan said, trying to focus on the problem. "You're right. We need to gather more evidence before accusing anyone," Richard agreed. Lisa nodded, supporting her husband and father-in-law in their decision. But Jonathan increasingly felt that there was more to this situation than met the eye. His intuition told him that this night would mark the beginning of something significant that would change their lives forever. As he left the office, Jonathan felt the cold night air wrap around him, bringing with it a sense of inevitable change. He couldn't know that the mystery they were trying to unravel would lead to shocking revelations and destroy many lives. "Dad, I'll take care of this. We'll find out who's behind this," Jonathan said, saying goodbye to his father. Richard nodded, expressing his confidence in his son, but left alone in the office, he stared out the window for a long time, contemplating the situation. The mystery of the night was only beginning to unfold, and no one knew what consequences it would bring the next morning. Jonathan woke up with a heavy heart, remembering the conversation with his father from the previous night. He knew there was a long and difficult task ahead to find the culprit. Lisa was already in the kitchen making breakfast. She looked calm, but Jonathan noticed a slight worry in her eyes. "Good morning," Jonathan said, kissing Lisa on the cheek. "Good morning, John," Lisa replied, trying to smile. Jonathan sat down at the table, and Lisa served him coffee and toast. They ate in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. After breakfast, Jonathan drove to work, determined to start his own investigation. He needed to understand which employee might be involved in the embezzlement at the office. Jonathan first approached his assistant Mark, who was always top-notch when it came to accounting. "Mark, I need you to help me with something. It's about the financial reports for the last few months. Are you able to accomplish that?" Naturally, Jonathan asked, attempting to hide his nervousness. "What exactly do you need?" Mark inquired, a little taken aback by the request. Jonathan said, "I just want to double-check some transactions because there's a suspicion that someone might have been falsifying the reports." Mark nodded and went straight to work. So Jonathan decided to walk around the office and observe the behavior of the employees. As the day went on, he became increasingly suspicious that one of his co-workers might be involved. By the evening, he felt his suspicions were beginning to take a more concrete form, and he came home to find Lisa sitting in the living room, looking at him anxiously, waiting for updates. After a hard day, Lisa inquired as she got up from the couch. "I think I'm starting to understand what's going on," Jonathan said. Lisa listened carefully as he discussed his thoughts and discoveries, but Jonathan couldn't get rid of the sensation that something was still unclear. Do you believe? Someone close to us could have done this, Lisa asked, leaning closer to her husband. I don't know, but I will find out, Jonathan replied, putting his arm around her shoulders. Meanwhile, Richard continued his own investigations. He realized the situation was much more serious than it seemed at first glance. Late that night, he received an anonymous message that complicated things even further. The message mentioned meetings between Lisa and an unknown man. Richard couldn't believe his eyes. He decided not to tell Jonathan until he was sure the information was true, but doubts began to creep into his mind. Could Lisa be involved in this? The next day, Jonathan threw himself into work again, trying to find definitive evidence. But his thoughts kept returning to his wife and her strange behavior. Lately, he started to notice how Lisa spent a lot of time alone and often went out in the evenings without explaining where she was going. Jonathan's doubts grew with each passing day. He decided to follow Lisa to understand what was happening. One evening, when she went out again, he followed her in the shadows of the trees. He saw Lisa meeting with a man. Jonathan froze watching their conversation. His heart pounded wildly when he saw Lisa and this man hugging and kissing. It was his father, Richard. Jonathan's world collapsed in an instant. He realized that the mystery they were trying to unravel was much deeper and more painful than he could have imagined. Jonathan stood in the shadows of the trees, unable to believe his eyes. His wife Lisa was kissing his father, Richard. His heart clenched with pain and anger. He didn't know what to do. Thoughts swirled in his head like a whirlwind, making it hard to focus. Finally gathered, giving him courage, Jonathan stepped out of his hiding place and walked toward them. Lisa and Richard pulled away from each other when they saw him. Jonathan, what's happening? Richard tried to say something, but the words got stuck in his throat. Jonathan, it's not what you think, Lisa said, trying to justify herself. Not what I think. I see is what's happening, he said, his voice shaking with rage. How could you both do that? Richard asked. Let me explain. He turned to Lisa and said, Don't call me that. Jonathan interrupted him. You betrayed me and you. How could you, Lisa, begin when I trusted you? Crying, John, please let me explain. But Jonathan didn't want to hear anything more. He turned and walked away, not wanting to see either of them again. Inside, a storm of emotions raged: betrayal, pain, anger, and despair. He felt deceived and empty. Back home, Jonathan locked himself in his bedroom. He sat in the dark, trying to understand how this could have happened. Thoughts of Lisa and his father behind his back wouldn't leave him alone. He didn't know what to do. The next day, Jonathan decided to take a leave of absence. He couldn't work while his thoughts were consumed by this situation. He went to the coast to be alone and think about everything that had happened a week past. In solitude and reflection, Jonathan tried to find the strength to deal with the situation. He knew he had to decide how to move forward. But each morning when he woke up, he felt the same pain and anger. Meanwhile, Lisa and Richard tried to contact him, but Jonathan ignored their calls and messages. He wasn't ready to talk to them. He didn't know if he could ever forgive their betrayal. One evening, while Jonathan was sitting on the shore watching the sunset, a stranger approached him. The elderly man said, I apologize for interrupting, but you look like you're carrying a heavy burden. Jonathan sighed. Yes, you're right. Terrible things have happened in my life. Sometimes to understand and forgive, you need time and support. The stranger added, I know it may sound cliché, but it's important not to shut yourself off from talking to someone. You don't have to go through this alone. Jonathan realized he needed to find a way to deal with this, so he decided to go back home and try to sort out his feelings before returning to the city. He first went to his friend Michael, whom he always trusted, and they sat in a CA, and Jonathan told him everything that had happened. Michael listened intently, without interrupting. That's terrible, Jonathan. I can't imagine how difficult it must be for you. But you must speak with them to hear what they have to say. Only then will you be able to find peace. Jonathan realized Michael was correct, that he couldn't avoid the situation indefinitely. He had to face the truth and make decisions about his future. Jonathan came home determined to deal with the situation. He knew he had to speak to Lisa and Richard, but he struggled to find the strength to do so. Nevertheless, he knew he could no longer ignore what was happening. The following day, Jonathan saw an odd note on the kitchen table. It was signed by his father, and it was addressed to Lisa. Jonathan's heart raced as he picked it up and read it. I need to see you tonight. I can't wait any longer. Meet me at our place, Richard. Jonathan felt a surge of anger and jealousy. He knew he had to do something to stop this. He decided to follow Lisa to see what was really going on that evening. Lisa left the house, clearly heading to the meeting place. Jonathan quietly followed her, trying not to draw attention. They walked several streets before reaching a small motel on the outskirts of town. Lisa went inside, and Jonathan stayed outside watching what was happening gathering. His courage, he decided to go inside and find the room where Lisa might be approaching one of the doors. He heard muffled sounds as his heart was pounding. He opened the door and saw something he never expected to see. Lisa and Richard were together, making love. Lisa was in a revealing latex outfit that hugged her figure, accentuating every curve. She lay on the bed, her arms around Richard, their bodies moving in unison, and her moans were full of passion. Richard, fully engrossed in the moment, touched her skin, his lips sliding down her neck to her shoulders. Lisa responded to him, her eyes closed in pleasure. Jonathan stood frozen, unable to believe what he was seeing and noticing him. Lisa and Richard pulled away from each other, shocked by his appearance. Jonathan, Lisa exclaimed, trying to cover herself. "What are you doing here?" Richard shouted, trying to get up from the bed. "How could you, Jonathan?" yelled his voice, trembling with rage. "How could you betray me like this?" Richard approached, trying to calm his son. "Jonathan, let's talk." But Jonathan didn't want to hear any explanations, for his anger overwhelmed him, and he punched his father in the face. Richard staggered, but quickly retaliated with a furious fight. Ensued, they fought without holding back, exchanging blows and shouting. Lisa screamed, begging them to stop, but the men didn't listen. The room was in chaos, furniture overturned and things flying everywhere. Finally, Jonathan was exhausted, stepped back, breathing heavily and looking at his father. "You're no longer my father," Jonathan said, his voice filled with pain and anger. And he turned to Lisa. "You betrayed me like no one else. I never want to see either of you again." With those words, Jonathan left the room, leaving Lisa and Richard in shock and confusion. He felt like his world was falling apart, but he knew he had to move forward, even if it meant leaving everything behind. Returning home, Jonathan packed his things and left the house that now felt foreign and empty. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew one thing: he had to start a new life, far away from those who had betrayed him a few days past. And Jonathan settled in a small hotel and tried to make sense of what had happened. He knew that a long and a difficult road to recovery lay ahead, but he was ready to walk it. He decided that he would never let anyone betray his trust again. It had been several weeks since Jonathan left the home he once shared with Lisa. All this time, he had been trying to find peace and sort out his thoughts. Despite his efforts, the painful feeling of betrayal still haunted him. Jonathan had settled in a small hotel on the outskirts of the city. The room was modest but cozy, and here he could be alone, away from everyone who had betrayed him. The days passed monotonously, morning runs, long walks, and evenings spent contemplating the future. But during one of these walks, fate gave him an unexpected gift. One day, while he was walking along the shore, enjoying the calm of the sea, he met an old friend, Sarah. Sarah had been a longtime family friend, and they hadn't seen each other for several years. She had moved to another city for work and happened to be here on vacation. "Jonathan, I can't believe it's you," Sarah exclaimed when she saw him. Jonathan turned and saw her. A faint smile lit up his face. "Sarah, is it really you? How long has it been?" They hugged, and Jonathan felt a warm feeling of returning to an old friendship starts to flood his heart. They sat on a bench by the shore and began to tell each other what had happened over the years. Sarah was a successful lawyer, and her career was on the rise. But when Jonathan told her about what had happened with Lisa and Richard, her face grew serious. "Jonathan, that's terrible. I'm so sorry you had to go through that," Sarah said, looking at him sympathetically. "Yeah, it was a tough blow. I still can't believe they did this to I," Jonathan replied, trying not to show how deeply it affected him. "You shouldn't go through this alone. If you need support, I'm here," Sarah said, gently touching his hand. Sarah suggested that Jonathan moved in with her for a while. Her house was in the suburbs, away from the noise and bustle of the city. This place could become a temporary refuge for Jonathan, where he could find peace and recover. Moving in with Sarah turned out to be the solution. He was looking for. Her home was spacious and cozy, surrounded by a garden and forest. Here, Jonathan could find solace in the quiet of nature and the care of an old friend. Sarah did everything she could to make him feel at home. She cooked dinners for him, organized walks, and was simply there when he needed to talk. With each passing day, Jonathan felt something more than just friendship growing between him and Sarah noticed how her eyes lit up when she looked at him and how her touches became more tender and attentive. New feelings that he had long suppressed began to emerge within him. One evening, as they sat on the terrace, enjoying the fresh air and a glass of wine, Sarah brought up a topic they had been avoiding all these days. "Jonathan, I think you need to talk to Lisa and Richard. Even if it's painful, you need to know the whole truth and try to close this chapter," Sarah said, looking at him seriously. "I don't know if I'm ready for that," Jonathan replied, gazing at the starry sky. "You don't have to do it right now, but think about it. Without it, you'll never be able to move on," Sarah said. Holding his gaze, Jonathan knew she was right. He couldn't run from his problems forever. He needed to confront them to find peace. But at that moment, he felt he needed something more, something that could give him a sense of life. He turned to Sarah and saw her face bathed in the soft light of the moon. His heart raced as he realized that he could no longer ignore his feelings for her. He moved closer and gently touched her hand. "Sarah, I can't hide it any longer. You mean more to me than just a friend," Jonathan said, his voice full of sincerity. Sarah looked at him, her eyes filled with tenderness. "Jonathan, I felt the same way for a long time, but I didn't want to pressure you." He leaned in and gently kissed her. At that moment, the whole world disappeared for both of them. They kissed under the stars, and each kiss was full of passion and tenderness. When they returned to the house, Jonathan closed the door and pulled Sarah to him. Lips met again, and a spark of passion ignited in the room. He gently lifted her in his arms and carried her to the bedroom. They fell onto the bed, continuing to kiss. Jonathan's hands glided over Sarah's body, exploring every curve and every line. He felt her body respond to his touch, and she trembled with pleasure. Sarah removed his shirt, her fingers caressing his chest and back until they were left in just their underwear. Jonathan slowly removed Sarah's dress, revealing her in lace lingerie that highlighted her beauty. He couldn't take his eyes off her. He leaned in and began kissing her neck, moving down to her chest. Sarah moaned with pleasure, her hands pressing him closer. "John, I want you," she whispered, her voice full of passion. 6 months had passed since Jonathan and Sarah started their new life together. Their relationship had grown stronger than ever. Together, they overcame difficulties, made future plans, and enjoyed every moment spent together. Gradually, their life became more stable and harmonious. One of their joint projects was a cabin in the countryside that they decided to build. They wanted to create a place where they could retreat and enjoy peace away from the hustle and bustle of the city. The cabin became a symbol of their new beginning and strong relationship. Building the cabin was a labor-intensive but exciting process. Every day, Jonathan and Sarah worked side by side, putting their effort and love into every corner. Jonathan felt their bond growing stronger with each passing day. One day, as they stood on the terrace watching the sunset, Jonathan felt it was time to take the next step in their relationship. "Sarah," he began, shaking her hand, "these past 6 months have been the most important in my life. You helped me deal with the pain and find myself again. I want you to know that I love you with all my heart." Sarah smiled and hugged him. "I love you too, Jonathan. You've made my life happy and complete." Jonathan pulled out a small box from his pocket and opened it. Inside was a diamond ring shining in the rays of the setting sun. "Sarah, will you marry me?" he asked, his voice full of hope and love. Sarah looked at him, her eyes filling with tears of joy. "Yes, Jonathan. I want to spend my whole life with you." They embraced, and Jonathan slipped the ring on her finger. In that moment, they felt their life was complete and whole, but new challenges awaited them ahead. One evening, as they were having dinner on the terrace, Sarah received a call from an old friend who gave her some unpleasant news. The company she worked for was facing financial problems, and they offered her a position to help restore it. "John, this is an important challenge for me, but I don't want to leave you," Sarah said, her voice full of doubt. Jonathan hugged her. "Sarah, this is your opportunity. We can get through this together. I'll support you no matter what." Sarah nodded, her eyes filled with determination. "Thank you, John. You always know how to support me." A few weeks later, Sarah left to help her company. Jonathan stayed behind, but their bond remained strong. They communicated every day, sharing their thoughts and feeling the distance couldn't break their love. Meanwhile, Jonathan continued working on the cabin. He wanted everything to be perfect for Sarah's return. He decorated the house with flowers, bought new furniture, and prepared a surprise for her homecoming. Finally, the day came when Sarah returned. Jonathan waited for her at the doorstep, his heart pounding with excitement when he saw her. His face lit up with a smile. "Sarah, welcome home," he said, embracing her. Sarah looked around and saw all the changes in the house. John, this is amazing. Did you do all this for me? Yes, Sarah. I wanted our home to be perfect, Jonathan replied, his voice full of love. They spent the evening enjoying their home and each other's company. Harmony returned to their life, and they felt they could overcome any difficulties together. Months passed, and their life became more stable. Jonathan and Sarah continued working on their projects and making plans for the future. But one day something happened that tested their relationship once again. Jonathan received a letter from Lisa. In the letter, she asked for forgiveness and spoke about how difficult it was without him. She admitted her mistakes and hoped for reconciliation. John, what are you going to do, Sarah? Asked when he showed her the letter. I don't know, Sarah. It's a difficult decision, Jonathan replied, feeling conflicted. Sarah took his hand. You have to do what you think is right. I'll support you no matter what. Jonathan thought it over. He knew that forgiving Lisa wouldn't change the past, but it might help him find peace. He decided to meet with her and talk. The meeting with Lisa was emotional. She was genuinely remorseful and hoped for forgiveness. Jonathan felt his anger and pain starting to ease. He realized he could forgive her, but that didn't mean he would go back to her. Lisa, I forgive you, but I can't come back. I have a new life and a new love, Jonathan said, his voice full of determination. Lisa nodded, her eyes filled with tears. Thank you, Jonathan. I understand. Returning home, Jonathan felt relieved. He knew he had made the right choice. Sarah was waiting for him at the doorstep, and he hugged her, feeling he had finally found his home and his love. Several years passed. Jonathan and Sarah got married and continued building their happiness. Their life was full of joy and love. They overcame all difficulties together and knew a bright future awaited them. There, the story was just beginning, but new chapters lay ahead. Jonathan and Sarah were determined and full of love, ready to overcome any obstacles and build their happiness together.